Hello, everyone, and welcome back. In this first video for our pre-lecture videos for Wednesday, we're going to do a bit of recap on some of the stuff we were talking about with with just clustering. And then in the next video, I'll introduce this idea of hierarchical clustering. So gray slides are recap slides, what we saw before. So last time I introduced this notion of what if we have like a newspaper website with many different articles from different categories. We might want some kind of automatic method of putting articles that fall into some category together from the data directly. The trick being, what if we don't have predefined labels for these categories? Can we infer something by clustering the data points together? Now, in particular, some terminology we introduced was talking about this idea of a cluster, which is defined by a centroid and some spread. So right now, we'll really be focusing on distance-based clustering. We'll talk later today, or in another video for today, how clustering might be a little bit more complex than that. So we introduced this notion that each cluster has a centroid and a spread. So here I have some data that was put into 3 groups, and they have 3 centroids and 3. So the task of clustering is coming up with an assignment for each data point xi, which cluster does it belong in. So there's also the trick of how many clusters do you want to make in the first place. That's another modeling choice. In this case, I'm assuming I have k clusters. In this picture, I'm showing k is 3. Each point needs to be assigned a cluster. And usually we're going to be doing assignments based off the closest centroid. So each data point will be assigned its closest centroid as the cluster belongs in. And we're going to need some kind of notion of score to define what that was, and we use that heterogeneity function that measured how far away every point assigned to it. We talked last time kind of briefly about how it's not always easy for something like clustering, in particular that K-means algorithm we introduced, to cluster examples that aren't just based off of distance. In particular, if there's some kind of structure here that's not just distance relationships to determine maybe what category or what cluster something belongs in, something that's like a distance-based approach might struggle a lot because it might make assumptions about how the centroids in the data relate to each other. Now, last time we introduced the K-means algorithm. The K-means algorithm, as a reminder, has a few steps. Step 0 is initialize some centroids to random points. And K-means is an iterative algorithm. So it starts with some initialization and then repeatedly does 2 steps. It first starts by taking the current centroids and assigning every point in the data set to the closest centroid. That's step 1. Step 2 is going through each centroid and updating it to be the average of all of the points that got assigned to it. So we saw that there was this iterative process where we start with assigning points to centroids and then updating centroids based on these points. Update them and move them to the average of all. And this, And this K-means algorithm, while kind of very simple to describe, is amazing that it actually works. This idea of doing this back and forth update actually does converge to some local optima. Not global, but definitely some hopefully good clustering. We talked about one of the big things that determines how well the result looks is the initial placement of the centroid, which then kind of inspired the Kmeans Plus algorithm, which biases the randomness of initial centroids to bias points far away from centroids we've already. Okay, that was everything we talked about on Monday. High level, a lot of the things we talked about. Now, there are some problems with the model that K-means assumes. So in real life, cluster assignments might not always be so clear-cut. So for example, if you take an event like the moon landing, is that an article about science, world news, and maybe some people might call that a conspiracy. So what's the right category for something that kind of fits in a lot of places? And because with K-means, we're minimizing Euclidean distance, what that's really kind of coming down to is assuming that all of the clusters are spherical. Because remember, with the Euclidean norm, the L2 norm, this is about circles, the equation of a circle. And so we're assuming that all of the points within the same ring of a circle would be the same distance. So here it's kind of assuming that the clusters are spherical, which may or may not be the case. Maybe one of the clusters might be stretched in a particular. You could sort of solve this, at least partially, with something like weighted Euclidean distance, where you treat each dimension with a different weight, but then it still assumes that every cluster has its own, the same orientation with just the same scaling factor. So in general, there's actually a few examples where k-means, the types of clusters that you might try to find if the data doesn't line up with this assumption, might fail pretty drastically. For example, if you have different size clusters, so maybe this green cluster is really big and the blue and red are really small, it's very possible that k-means might label this data such that all of these get labeled in point 1, all of these points get labeled in group 2, and all of these examples get labeled in, which pretty clearly does not follow the kind of intuitive picture of the Mickey Mouse ears. It's really just putting things based on closeness, and if you have different size clusters, this can get a little complicated with the centroid. Also, some other particular cases that are hard for k-means is when the clusters overlap. We talked a little bit about that last time. But also kind of this new idea that if you have clusters that are oriented or shaped in different ways, k-means generally struggles with them. Now, it's okay generally to use k-means in this context if the clusters are far apart. But if the clusters kind of have a little bit of overlapping and they have these different orientations, k-means tends to really struggle here. Now, one way of trying to get around this is to use more flexible approaches. In particular, one very powerful approach is called a mixture model. A mixture model is really just trying to model probability distributions over the examples. So one very popular kind of mixture model is assuming all of the clusters are shaped like normal distributions, but a little bit higher, like a higher dimension. We sometimes call this the mixture of Gaussian. You can imagine that with different settings, and it gets a little complex with the math, we're not going to dive into that, but you can orient and scale those different normal distributions differently. And so you kind of think about this as a mixture of Gaussians, popular thing, but there's other types of mixture models that mix different probabilities. And this allows for differentiation between cluster shapes and sizes. Now, I'm not going to have you be super familiar with mixture models because they're a bit out of our scope, but it is an interesting type of algorithm that I would like you to know the term of. When they say mixture models, it's about mixing probability. In particular, one very kind of popular type of algorithm that works with many of these mixture models is called the EM algorithm, expectation maximization algorithm. In fact, k-means is a special case of an EM algorithm, where it's doing this kind of back and forth updating. It just simplifies or kind of limits what types of assumptions it makes data. But this kind of back and forth update is actually a very, very general pattern for something like EM. And one of the big ideas of mixture models that makes them really powerful is it allows probabilistic assignments to clusters. The big idea is, or we sometimes call those soft assignments. The big idea is that you say a document might have a 54% chance of belonging to world news, 45% chance of science, 1% conspiracy, 0%. And that flexibility, while it can sometimes add complexity and might make it difficult, does work quite well in the long. So that's why I wanted to talk about failure modes and kind of extensions of. What we're going to talk about in the next video is a really important extension of clustering, thinking about this thing called hierarchical